Hello, good night to our guests and our followers on this program. Welcome to Legalize this 25th day of May, 2025. Tonight, we are looking at Pan Africanism and in the era of reparations on this auspicious occasion, today being African Liberation Day. We are having little technical issues with regard to two of our guests so far, so you'll just bear with us. We'll sort that out. But in the meantime, we just want to recognize the sponsors of this program: Gel Professional Solutions Inc., Gem FM carrying this program on FM radio out of Canada, and also Grenada Technical and Allied Workers Union.
Attention all workers, your health and safety at work are critical. At Grenada Technical and Allied Workers Union, we are dedicated to ensuring you have a safe and secure work environment. If you encounter unsafe conditions or are involved in an accident, take immediate actions. Report it to the company, your shop steward, and make sure it reaches your union. Your health and safety is a priority, and a strong union means a strong voice for your rights. Don't wait. Address concerns right away and protect your well-being. For a safer workplace and a better quality of life, stand with the Grenada Technical and Allied Workers Union. Together, we can create a safer, healthier work environment for everyone.
Welcome back, and welcome once again to our guests. We have with us Dr. Bright Gyamfi from Ghana. We have Professor Clinton Hutton, although I'm not sure if he's there. He seems to be with us, yes. We have Tesfa AkiWawa Peterson, Grenadian, based in Canada. And we are expecting in a few minutes to be joined by Deadria. In a few minutes, we are expected to be joined by Deadria Farmer-Paellmann. She's based in the US. She will join us in a few minutes. As soon as we sort out these technical issues. Yes, I think we have Deadria now. Good night, good night.
Greetings.
Okay, greetings. We are saying we have a little technical problem with Professor Clinton Hutton. We're still hoping that he will come on. The technical assistant is trying to work it out with him, but we are looking to start. So we just want to welcome you. This is Deadria, the other guest, Dr. I think we may have Clinton now. We have Dr. Bright Gyamfi from Ghana, based in the US. We have Tessa AkiWawa Peterson, Grenadian, based in Canada. This is the co-host, Aisha Mclean, Grenadian, with Ghanese, Antigua, and Grenada, very much a Caribbean person. She's an attorney at law. And I have a young co-host here with me who I have to try to keep under some control. So please bear with me on that. So welcome all.
Thank you.
Yes, so as we said, this is an auspicious occasion, today being African Liberation Day, the topic being Pan-Africanism in the era of reparations being one of the great subject matters of the current era. But of course, there are others, and we hope to take a dive into those tonight. And I will invite Dr. Bright to start off the program.
Thank you so much. First of all, it's a great opportunity to be here
and especially on this special day, as you mentioned, about the African Liberation Day and what it means for those of us on the continent and in the diaspora. African Liberation Day means so much for thinking about our own freedom as it's still a project that we are still undertaking, a project that has been birthed for so many centuries, way before the official formation of the Pan African Congress that took place in London in 1900. Before that, a lot of African intellectuals, artists have all come together to think about freedom through music, high life, through the Negro spirituals in the Americas, calypso, and so many different forms of music to express people's desires to be free. Whether it's Bob Marley talking and quoting Marcus Garvey that we should emancipate ourselves from mental slavery, none other than we can free ourselves. Or the famous speech on March 6, 1957, when Nkrumah stated that there's a new African in town and that new African is ready to fight their own battle. May 25th and captures these longer history of Black internationalism. In my own research, been fascinated about how those in Grenada were very much committed to this project of African liberation. Slogans like the African struggle is our struggle. These are the themes that have been carried by people of African descent when Ghana gained independence in March 6, 1957. Lord Kitchener from Trinidad and Tobago singing that song, The Birth of Ghana, coincided with the Ghanaian high life musician Ghana Freedom, singing these joys of freedom, that the long liberation struggle is still an ongoing project. So I'm very happy to be here to discuss this history and what it means for Africans and people of African descent all over the world.
Yes, and the colonial powers and others have done such a job in ensuring that we don't know our own history. So I don't want you to take anything for granted. And Nkrumah was who?
Yes.
I'm asking, Nkrumah was who?
Kwame Nkrumah?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, so Kwame, for those who are not familiar, Kwame Nkrumah was the first president of Ghana. He led Ghana to the independence from Britain. Ghana becoming the first sub-Saharan African country to gain independence. Nkrumah led Ghana at a time when even the British Secretariat made a statement that Ghana and Africa in general will not be free or will not be entitled to independence for centuries to come. So Nkrumah leading Ghana to becoming the first sub-Saharan African country to gain independence marked a significant rupture in the racial colonial relation that tried to highlight white supremacy and tried to advance this whole notion of Black inferiority. Ghana took on that long tradition of Haiti when Haiti ruptured that same colonial racial bondage that challenged this idea of Black people as inferior, Black people as uncivilized, Black people as primitive. And Nkrumah making Ghana a symbol of Black liberation also actively contributed to helping those who were fighting for liberation from the continent as well as from the Caribbean. There were a number of scholars and activists from the Caribbean, from Guyana to Haiti, who came to Ghana as well to help build this new nation. That Ghana was not just a country for those who find themselves in what the colonial boundaries had carved as the Gold Coast, which the name later was changed to Ghana. The Ghana, as in the words of the Pan African leader Kwame Nkrumah, stated that Ghana's independence was meaningless unless it is linked with the total liberation of Africa. And for so many people who are trying to find refuge, whether from the US, from the Caribbean, from the continent, Ghana had become the destination of radical hope. And it is that hope in that long tradition of freedom that made Ghana this black star, understanding its place, understanding its role in history, to be a light. When that light came to a dim with the overthrow of Kwame Nkrumah, others continued that project of freedom. And it is that project of freedom for Black liberation, for African peoples worldwide. That is why we are here to celebrate this May 25th, African Liberation Day, as we are all African peoples, to talk about strategies as to how we can keep advancing this hope for freedom, the struggle for freedom, this fight for emancipation in the world that tries to silence Black people with the neoliberalism project, neocolonialism project, and the assault, constant assault of African peoples.
And March 6, 1957 being the Independence Day, right?
Yes.
Okay, good. Okay. Tesfa, you want to take off from there?
I do. Thank you so much again. Thank you, Joseph and Aisha, and to all my fellow panelists for inviting me to be a part of this discussion this evening. I'm going to take a slightly different track than Bright, but we'll get back to all of this juicy conversation, I'm sure, at some point. But I learned the word Pan-Africanism at home from my father in his bookshelves. I learned the name Steve Biko. I knew that Steve Biko was a freedom fighter who had been killed by the apartheid regime in South Africa. I remember the cover of a book called The Man Died that was written by Wole Soyinka, the Nigerian playwright. I would meet Wole Soyinka later on in my life, very much later. In my childish imagination, I thought that he had died long ago. But then one day, sitting in my home in Canada, I saw him on the CBC, on the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. And I thought to myself, oh, this is somebody who's alive, somebody whose words I had read as a child in Grenada. I learned all the names: Hannibal the Great, Malcolm X, Nelson Mandela, Marcus Garvey, Nkrumah, Kenyatta, Lumumba, Amilcar Cabral, all of the names. I learned Pan-Africanism from my father's books. And I learned Pan-Africanism from Rastafarian prophets that sang liberation. Everyone needed liberation. The whole of the world needed liberation. I learned Pan-Africanism in the words of Bunny Wailer. I learned Pan-Africanism in the words of Peter Tosh and from culture. And as a little child growing up in a small village of Chantimel in Grenada, something in me knew that I was connected to bigger, broader themes of history, to things that had happened in the past and to things that were to happen in the future that all concerned me. And Pan-Africanism to me, before I knew the words Pan-Africanism, was an idea and an ideal of freedom and of liberation that was fomented in my child's mind as being important to my formation, to my identity, to who I was in the world, that I was connected up to African peoples everywhere, that I was connected to a place, a continent called Africa, and that what was occurring on that continent was important to me, to my identity as a Black woman in the Caribbean. And that was a powerful idea for me. And the idea that idea of being connected to Black peoples around the world has been the underlying thread of everything that I've done in my life up till now, and has allowed me to think about what it means to be an intellectual in the world, but what it means in the great tradition of Pan Africanism to put that intellectualism, in the words of another great Pan Africanist, Walter Rodney, to put that intellectualism in the groundings, to be activist, to be involved, to be community minded. And so a lot of my thinking around Pan Africanism has led me to do a particular kind of intellectual work in a particular kind of intellectual community that is concerned with Black women, that is concerned with the life of Helen Louise Langdon in particular, that brings me back to Grenada, even though I've gone away to study, as we say, has brought me back to communities in Grenada, to the community of Ladigue, to work together in community with people there to recover the life and legacy of Helen Louise Langdon, to memorialize her life and legacy, and to think about what that life, that legacy gives us for future thinking around freedom, around liberation, what it means that a woman who was a Gaviite, who was involved in the work of the UNIA, is birthed in Grenada, made a diasporic journey, came to a place like Montreal, went to the United States Midwest, and how her life and legacy is a part of what we understand Pan-Africanism to be as well. So Pan-Africanism for me has been, before, like I said, I got the words for it, has been the driving force, I believe, of my life and the work that I like to do and the work that I want to do. Mhm.
Great. Really great. Thank you. That's all. Welcome. Good night, Clinton. We had some technical
Greetings.
problems, right? But I think we have resolved those problems.
Yeah, well, I hope so. I hope so. But it's
Yes,
good
yes.
to be here anyway.
The loud and clear, and very powerful as usual.
All right. I will not
Okay.
continue to try on my laptop.
Yes. So we
Yeah.
want to invite you one time to join the conversation. I don't know how much you heard, but I don't
No,
think.
I just heard just a little bit from the last speaker talking about Malcolm's mom.
Yes.
You remember you took me to where she used to live.
Yes.
I
And
spent some time there, took some photos and videos.
that was several years ago. I think what year was that? 2020 or 19 or somewhere there?
Thereabouts.
Yes. And the young lady here is speaking about that because she does some work with a community group
Yes.
in Ladigue, yes. Yes, but it's always something that many of us were always mindful about and very hopeful that Grenada could have leveraged that, But everything has its time, Hopefully we could have done it in the revolution, but the story about that. But as they say, everything has its time, and I'm certainly the
Yeah,
first.
well, it's important to mark those sites
Yeah.
and to ritualize those sites
Mhm.
because that's part of the education that we need as a people. If we don't do that, we'll always be stymied by colonial education and colonial narratives. We have to really ritualize our space, battle sites, sites of birth, and where our forebearers who are very important to us, sites of spiritual rituals, and so on. It's very important that we do that because that forms a very important part of our education.
And I know, Clinton, that your own view is that even our liberation struggle in the Caribbean here, starting with Haiti,
Yes.
Was very much in terms of its values and spirituality. It was
Yes.
very much influenced by what our forebears would have brought in their souls and their hearts for Africa, rather than
Yes.
the traditional view that it was the French and the values from the American independence and so revolution that were really at play there. So in that
Yes.
sense, I think we you can now take us to the fact that based on your thinking that Pan-African values and Pan-African ways of processes were long at play in the Caribbean because it was
Absolutely.
yes.
Absolutely. The Asian Revolution is a Pan-African revolution. It's Pan-African in a number of ways. It's Pan-African because, in fact, most of the persons who were combatants in that revolution were born in Africa and came to Haiti, Saint Domingue, as the French call it, 10 to 15 years before the revolution. So at least 68 or so % of the combatants were born in Africa. The rest were born in the Caribbean, mostly in Haiti. But there were people there from, Henri Christophe, the Grenadian, one of the leaders of the revolution. Bookman Doty, the first leader, was a Jamaican. Dessalines, who took Haiti to independence, was born in Haiti. So it was a Pan-African revolution, the first successful revolution of its type in history, and that revolution has given to the world values that were not there before. It's the first state in all of humanity that declared that no one has a right to own another's property. The first state in all of history is the first state which states that a people has a right to self-determination. At a time when the colonial powers in Europe were colonizing black people wherever they were. Even when they championed the cause of liberty and the pursuit of happiness, people of African descent were enslaved. Slavery ended in the United States in 1863, at least the Declaration of Emancipation. But Africans, well, let us even look at independence. When America under Washington declared independence, for 90 years after that, when they declare independence and their Declaration of Rights of Man, 90 years after that, America held Africans in enslavement, even while they declare themselves to be democratic. Right? So we have to understand these things. It's important to understand our history, because sometimes we have the hiding of that history and the desecration of that history. Or if history begun when you start to speak about it. As we know with the case of the Palestinians, that somehow everything started on October 7, right? Ignoring everything that happened before, or that everything that happened to people of African descent started with their enslavement. Before that, Africans have no history. That's stupid, right? Africa's contribution to the world before their enslavement is probably the most important contribution to the development of human civilization in the cultural, intellectual, and technological sense. It can no longer be denied. But guess what? Even in our schools today, many years after independence, these things are not taught in school. Our journey only began with enslavement and colonial subjection. And therefore, we are still very much bound by the pedagogy of colonialism. And we have to resist that. We have to take these things out of our schools. Right? I mean, I concluded in a recent book we had on Gyamfi that we don't need a white population in Jamaica for white supremacists to work. It's all about our education. It's all about not being able to decolonize our intellectual path, decolonize our epistemologies, decolonize our notions of beauty, decolonize ideas about the technological development of the world and the role of Africans in that, their role in the development of mathematics, in the development of philosophy. It's not that these things don't exist. I mean, it's like the other day you hear about the celebration marking the 80th anniversary of the defeat over Nazism, and somehow the Russians, the Soviets, now Russians, are reduced to a minimal player. It's crazy. It is absolutely crazy. And therefore we have to be vigilant and be on our P's and Q's in terms of how we treat with our education system, how we treat with our rituals, how we treat with the sights and sounds and words of ancestry. Because if we don't do that, those who while arguing that, oh, slavery happened so long ago, we had nothing to do with it, and therefore don't talk to us about reparation, they continue in the tradition to defend white supremacy, even in modern clothing. So we have to be careful.
Yes, Clinton. So, in fact, as Marcus said and Bob Marley popularized, mental slavery, if we don't emancipate ourselves from that, as you said, you don't need a white population, you don't need a white ruling class to have white supremacy.
Precisely, and you know, it is exactly that. Emancipate yourselves from mental slavery. That's why God was able to conclude in his philosophy and opinions that the most important liberating force for Africans and people of African descent is education. Right? And he says that the primary goal, the first goal of education is self-discovery. So he was hinting at the role of colonial education in the subordination of our people. And unless we exercise colonial education by the education that people like Gyamfi spoke about, and before Gyamfi, Blyden, and Tilafia Schultz, and Hubert Harrison, and the Guyanese scholar, George James, and so on. These people were in the 19th century and some in the 18th century advocating then that education ought to teach people of African descent about their roots and about ancestral epistemologies and ancestral ontologies, ideas, notions of identity and theories of education. Right? It's not a 20th century thing with Gyamfi. Gyamfi latched on to a philosophical tradition that was set by people in enslavement. Gyamfi was born 49 years after slavery was abolished. But the tradition from whence he came was not established by him. It was established by people who faced enslavement. And part of their struggle against enslavement was a struggle against white supremacy, was a struggle against the philosophy of the colonizers. And we can't be in the 21st century, be latch on to that philosophy and continue generation after generation for people not knowing themselves. Right? And people who don't know themselves, they will fall for anything.
Yes. Sister Farmer, you can come in right there now.
Yes, absolutely. I agree 100%. If we don't know who we are, we can actually fall for anything. I actually came to the subject matter of, or the philosophy of Pan-Africanism very late in life, I would say. I never really studied Pan-Africanism. I was just I just ended up engaged in actions that we define today as Pan-Africanism. First of all, I head up an organization called the Restitution Study Group that does litigation and advocacy for slavery reparations. We also do advocacy for ownership of a group of African artifacts called the Benin Bronzes. And this is a very controversial subject matter for us to be engaged in, because there are Pan-Africanists who do not agree with our perspective. But I'm going to get to that. But as far as Pan-Africanism is concerned, it actually started in Nigeria. And for me, what it means is the unity of African people globally. And then after that, there's a lot of different directions you can go in. It depends on what your interests are. Some people want to repatriate, and some people, have absolutely no interest in even visiting Africa. But to a certain extent, if they identify as African Americans or Afro descendants, they too, I believe, have some sense of Pan-Africanness or unity. Okay. But for me, I was invited to Nigeria in 2005 because we had been engaged in reparations litigation that utilized DNA testing to connect us to our specific African countries. And some of us were even able to be connected to our ethnic groups. Okay. Now, at that point, I had already completed law school, and during the time that I was in law school, I did an internship in Kenya, in Africa. I studied law there one summer, and what I learned there was tribalism. Something that I had no idea existed, but for many African people, most of the continent, in fact, folks identify by their tribal nations and not necessarily as one unified body of people, even though they're all living on the same continent. Different ethnic groups just didn't necessarily view themselves as family. By the way, this was shocking to me because I just thought all African people, identified as African, and regardless of what country they're coming from. In any case, with the DNA testing, what I had proposed was that we utilize them to reach folks on a tribal level, so that we can try with a true sense of unity that way, versus everyone just putting on the label African, especially if you're in the diaspora. So that was attractive to Nigeria. And of course, I went and I said, okay, now that we can figure out where we're from, African Union, Nigeria, it's time to welcome us home. Because we can say I'm coming from Nigeria, I'm coming from Sierra Leone, or whatever it is. So bottom line is with Pan Africanism, as much as we want to believe in this philosophy, there's a lot that Africa must do to show that it is interested truly in Pan Africanism. Otherwise, we are functioning in what Queen Mother Moore would say, who I have to say she is the Pan Africanist that I identify most with. But she used to say that we were suffering from psychoneurosis. And I guess that meant anything weird that we do as traumatized people who have been forcibly removed from our homeland. How do we embrace a philosophy that says that we must all be unified when African nations have independence and have not taken the step to invite us all home right away? I mean, they have the power to do this. And so, it's for me, I have to say, I want to embrace this label Pan-African, and I do. In general, I embrace the philosophy, but I realize there's a lot of work. We have a lot of work to do, and by the grace of God and the ancestors, today we are seeing these DNA tests actually allowing folks to be invited home with citizenship included. For example, the Benin Republic now invites people home on the basis of DNA test results. You're not just, in fact, you don't even necessarily have to have the DNA test, from what I understand. You have to just be able to prove that you are a descendant of enslaved people who were forcibly removed from Africa. It's the first nation to do that, and this is recent. It hasn't even been a year that this has been possible. This is what I consider Pan-African unity. I mean, this is what I consider not steps that will help us to overcome the trauma of the separation. Now, another thing that I'm engaged in, you all probably know, I do reparations litigation against companies complicit in slavery. We focus on them, we reach out to them, we tell them, we do the research, we can prove their connection to slavery, and we make a demand that they share the wealth that they acquired enslaving us. Okay. Now, here's another place where, as Queen Mother Moore would say, where the psychoneurosis is showing. We have done the same thing with African tribes, one tribe in particular, the Benin Kingdom, because the iconic Benin bronzes were made with, and I don't have it today, I apologize, but a metal slave trade currency called the Manila, kind of looks like my fingers, the way they're shaped, about that same size, 50 of which bought a woman, 57 bought a male. They were melted down and cast into the metal Benin bronzes. Today, these relics are worth $30 billion. They've been dispersed globally, and because during Britain's effort to colonize the Benin Kingdom, they extracted the bronzes. But it didn't start that way. There was some fighting that went on before a complete massacre by the Benin Kingdom of about 250 African soldiers and British who were working with British soldiers. None of them, they were unarmed, but no one talks about that side of the story. But that's not our issue. Our issue is that these relics were made enslaving us. Most of the people were, the documents that we have were sold to Jamaica, right? They were exported to Jamaica. The next largest group that's documented went to Brazil. Okay. Now, we have been demanding since 2022 that Afro-descendants, that's all of us forcibly removed from Africa during the transatlantic slave trade, or the Mayangamizi, which some folks prefer to call it. We should have some say over what happens to these relics. But my greatest resistance in this work is coming from people who label themselves Pan-Africanists. And that's where, I have to say, we as Pan-Africanists need to understand that if we are all African, if we all belong to the continent, if we were removed, these, not only do these bronzes belong to us, but the resources, all of the resources in Africa belong to us as well. And if we're not allowed to engage in the decision-making around these relics or even the resources, then we have to really make greater demands on our brothers and sisters in Africa. I mean, I can't say it any more plainly. The bronzes belong to all of us. And as Afro-descendants, it's critical that we speak up and make it clear that this is an issue that matters to us, and not just transfer over our rights to our cultural heritage. This is wealth that should have been paid to our ancestors who were forced out of Africa. Allow them to go to slave trader heirs just because they are Black. Now, Pan-African philosophy, there's different schools of thought. There's a more radical side of Pan-Africanism that opposes elitism, regardless of where it is, whether it's Black or whether it's white, whether it's the British royal family or African royal families. So the notion that elite African royals should be given these relics because they were the ones that enslaved us historically and received this wealth goes against, what Pan-Africanists believe in general. So it's just really, for me, this day is important. This subject is critical, and it's very important to really think about how do we protect our own interests while working together with others under this label Pan-African. Okay. So that's my contribution.
Yeah, Aisha, you want to come in?
Yes, I just wanted to say it was pretty interesting getting different points of view as to how Pan-Africanism actually operates. Usually when you hear about it, it's a very narrow subject, but now you're getting it from Deidre's point of view with tracing the companies who were involved in slavery. You're getting Clinton's point of view. Dr. Bright was interested, and then Tesfa, more so the community based, and especially in Grenada. So with that, I think it is important for us to know to kind of jump into the challenges facing Pan-Africanism. Mr. Layne, unless it is that you have something you want to add before we jump into it.
No. I don't know, Clinton, I think you want to take off from there, or Bright.
Sorry.
Yes.
I can go after you.
No, I was going to say that Pan-Africanism as a historical concept and a form of struggle for redemption is an African diaspora phenomenon. Pan-Africanism was born in the African diaspora of the Americas, especially the axis of the Caribbean and North America, in particular the United States. The first stage of Pan-Africanism emerged with organizations like in Brazil, Candomblé. In the Eastern Caribbean, what was known as Shouter Baptists are now regarded as spiritual Baptists. In Trinidad, what was called Shango and now called Orisha. In Haiti, Voodoo. In Cuba, what is called now called Santeria. The Africans in Cuba who started it during slavery, they call it Lukumi, which is a Yoruba tradition. And then there's another tradition in Cuba called Palo or Palo del Monte, which is the African name for it. By it's mainly rooted in the Congolese tradition in Africa, in Cuba, called Mayombe. Pan-Africanism came as a result of people taken for over 350 years into enslavement in the Americas. In the Caribbean, in Jamaica, for example, over 1 million people were taken in Jamaica into enslavement. But they were people coming from different parts of Western Africa, West Africa, West Central Africa. There were some people who were taken from East Africa, from Mozambique, for example. But the majority of Africans taken to this part of the world came out of West Africa and West Central Africa. That is Congo, what is now called Angola, and so on and so forth. What that does, what that demographic mixing did, was to create a Pan-Africanist view of self and of the world. So the culture that we developed in the Caribbean and the United States was really a Pan-African culture. And the spirituality that we developed was really Pan-African. But politically, what emerged from that as well is political Pan-Africanism. And we can link some of those to figures from the Caribbean, like H. Sylvester Williams, Henry Sylvester Williams from Trinidad. We have George Padmore as well from Trinidad. These are early 20th century figures. We have Marcus Garvey from Jamaica. We have in the early 19th century a man by the name of Vakti from Haiti who wrote about the Haitian Revolution in a strict Pan-Africanist way in the early 19th century. Right? So we have people like W.E.D. Du Bois from the United States and so on. So we have a pantheon of people coming out of, some of them born in slavery. As is Blyden. Blyden was taken from Africa into slavery in the Caribbean. Blyden became a Pan-Africanist. He has written. His works are there to be read. Right? So Pan-Africanism, in its earliest form, established organizations that helped the people to fight slavery. That's what Voodoo did. In fact, the Haitian Revolution is a Pan-Africanist revolution, but I also call it a Voodoo revolution. In fact, C.L.R. James, who wrote the Black Jacobins, argued that Voodoo was the medium of the revolution. But that's as far as he went. I took that and wrote a book about the logic and historical significance of the Haitian Revolution and the cosmological roots of Haitian freedom. To use that line by C.L.R. James and to build up what spirituality meant culturally, politically, and psychologically to the people, to allow them to survive slavery, to live with its brutalities in order to be able to fight it. And I use concrete examples. In other words, enslaved Africans use where they're coming from, African spiritualities, and they wove it into the different demographic populations since they're forced to live together. And out of that came Pan-Africanism. Pan-Africanism is a diaspora religion, entity. Then in the 19th century, and especially late 19th century, because slavery ended, the last place to have kept Africans in enslavement was Brazil. Slavery ended in Brazil in 1888. It ended in Cuba in 1876. There were people still living in Cuba up to 1970 who were born in slavery. Right? But what started to happen after that? So we have the colonial division of Africa, which officially, but happened before that, was going on before that, but what is called the Berlin Conference of 1884, 1885, and what European historians call the scramble for Africa, then divided up Africa, having taken out some 18 million people out of Africa into enslavement for 300 odd years, then proceeded to colonize the continent itself. And that's for over 100 years. Right? Now, during that period of time, we have the first European war, called World War I, the second European war, World War II, and the fact that Africans were taken into Europe to fight the war. Jamaicans went to fight for Britain. Your people from Senegal went to fight for France, and so on and so forth. Right? In fact, the early coups in Africa were coups that supported colonialism, because the early military in Africa were built by the European powers, for the European powers. I know, for example, in Jamaica, the first West India regiment, that these are people who were bought during slavery and after slavery and made into a black regiment. They were sent to Haiti during the revolution to reimpose slavery on Haiti. Right? They were also sent, there are black Jamaicans in the first West India regiment who were sent to colonize part of Ghana, the area of Kumasi and those places. They were subjected by Jamaicans joining with the British troops. So we need to understand this. And there can be a whole debate about how they divide and rule us. But the first war and the second war not only saw soldiers going to fight on the European theater for European powers, while they did not have freedom in their own countries. Several of those soldiers then were admitted to universities in Europe, like our Pan-Africanist Dudley Thompson in Jamaica. Dudley Thompson was in the RAF. After the RAF, he did law in London. But he was at the 5th Pan-African Congress in the early 1940s, along with Kwame Nkrumah.
From Ghana.
From Ghana. Along with Easton Banda. Right?
Mm-hmm.
And others,
mm-hmm.
including Kenyatta.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Now, that constitute now the broadening of Pan-Africanism.
Mm-hmm.
There were Pan-Africanists in the ANC, especially in the trade union affiliate of the ANC, which was founded, the ANC founded 1912. But there were people who were reading Garvey's newspaper that black soldiers took on ship, hide them, and distribute them in the ports, deposit them in ports in Africa. Right? And therefore, there was a tendency in the ANC with this Pan-Africanist concept of how Africa should be reconstituted. Right? So Ghana was the first African state. Not the first, because Egypt was there before, but generally people say that it's first African state to become independent.
And Ethiopia.
Kwame Nkrumah was a strict Pan-Africanist. He said the most important work he has ever read is the philosophy and opinions of Marcus Garvey. And the black star in the Ghanaian flag is the star of the UNIA. The black star for the Black Star Line shipping company established by Garvey and the UNIA. Nkrumah was of the view that Africa should become one nation. But so were early other independence leaders in Africa. Right?
Yes.
What are we seeing now? We are seeing in the Sahel, in Burkina Faso and Mali, we are also seeing the response of global African peoples to the leadership of Traoré. It's not a leadership just for Burkina Faso. It's a leadership. More and more young people in Africa are calling for what Kwame Nkrumah and Lumumba in the early independence time were calling for. What is one of the logic of that? Apart from the fact that people need to merge their skills, their intellect, their ingenuity to build this space that was subjected to European control, which is what there would be no France without their colonization. France would be a backwater country to this day, right? So what we have, one of the logics of Pan-Africanism as it reconstituted itself in the 20th century, the mid and late 20th century, about one Africa, is because of the colonial project of 1840, 1884, 1885 that split up Africa. There was no place named Nigeria. Nigeria is a British construction. And what they have actually done, the European powers, was to colonize people irrespective of who they were, because there were different nationalities and ethnicities in Africa that they just carve up. And the view is, I don't use the word tribe, the view is that if we try to redo what was done in the colonial project, Africa would be beset by war and not development. And therefore, let the boundaries stay where they are. But what we will be in these boundaries is one Africa. That's a logic of the early Pan-Africanists in African independence, Kwame Nkrumah, Julius Nyerere, and so on. Right? In fact, that is what is being revised now under the leadership of Traoré in Burkina Faso. And in fact, Traoré has done something that we have last seen during the time of Garvey, not even during the time of the great liberation struggles against apartheid or against in the 1960s and 1970s against apartheid and against the Portuguese in Angola and Mozambique, and the role that Cuba played in that liberation struggle. Right? What we are seeing is, especially amongst young people, is that 1920s call of Gyamfi for a Pan-Africanist reconstitution of Africa. What we are seeing in now the 21st century amongst young people, not just on the African continent, but in the diaspora, that they are also calling for that, even when some of them don't know much about Gyamfi. But the logic in which African peoples, their leaders were assassinated if they were for the people. That's what happened to Lumumba. That's what happened to Sankara. That's what happened to Cabral. That's what happened to Chris Hani. That's what happened. They were for the people and not for the colonial states in European powers, and so they were killed. And they want to do the same to Sankara, to Traore. Right? But I'll stop here for now.
Okay.
I've been going on too long.
Dwight, you want to come in? And I see Aisha want to come in again too.
I think
but Dwight wants to go first.
I mean, you've captured everything that I was going to point out, because I think it's very critical and important that we think about the Pan-African project as when enslaved Africans were brought to the Americas. They did not hold on to these identities as we are Ghanaians or we are Angolans or we are Nigerians, because these are social constructions that was birthed, as was rightly pointed out, in 1884, 1885 was the Berlin Conference. When these people were brought into the Americas and they're being enslaved, it creates a political consciousness that people have to come together. So as CLR James even pointed out, that the Haitian Revolution was both a struggle that Africans that were born on the continent were pushing the forefront on that particular project, in conjunction to those who were born in the diaspora. And as Clinton illuminated so eloquently, the Pan-African project becomes a political project that these people are then pushing. So when you even get to the formal Pan-African Congress that took place in London, you have people from the Gold Coast, modern-day Ghana, and other African countries, colonies, coming to London to participate in that conference, and people from the Caribbean, people from the US, all coming to participate within that particular conference, thinking about how can we come together to challenge colonialism, to challenge and reform. That what we're interested in at that particular time was reforming the colonial project so that Africans will be treated better. But when we get to 1945, the Fifth Pan-African Congress, that one takes a more radical turn, where people are advocating for the end of colonial rule, that we have to take the battle back to the African continent. So you have people that become very invested in that particular project. And you have the likes of Nkrumah from modern-day Ghana and George Padmore kind of emerging as the dominant face of this particular movement. So when Ghana eventually gained independence in 1957, there was an invitation for Africans from all over the continent, those from the Caribbean, to move to join forces to help build this nation state. And as I had illuminated earlier, in Nkrumah's own words, that Ghana's independence was meaningless unless it is linked with the total liberation of the continent. His influence, the influence that he drew from Marcus Garvey, speaks to this longer project of Pan-Africanism or Black internationalism. And you see that type of project also being extended when Ghana, after Nkrumah's overthrow, became hostile to Ghanaian intellectuals. That Africans were now running for refuge and were being held by their African American brothers and sisters in the US, in the Caribbean, and etc. And even in modern day Ghana, there are invitations of African Americans and those from the diaspora being given the opportunity to get citizenship. And that's something that has been going on for decades. Even 2019, the Ghanaian government announced the year of return. And as recent as today, Ghana has just signed a deal with Jamaica, where Ghanaians will be going to Jamaica, doctors and nurses. So you see these Pan-African tendencies still at play. Sometimes it's not as radical as we saw in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, but it's a new energy among the youth that is coming to play that we have not seen in a while.
Yeah, great. Aisha, you wanted to add something or to ask a question in David?
Not particularly, Mr. Layne, you go ahead.
Yes, this is great. Anyone, but in particular, maybe Clinton and Dwight. You wanted to come in? Yes, come in.
Yeah. No, I think the question was what are some of the challenges with Pan-Africanism?
Yeah, I'd also like to respond to that. Yes, thank you. Yeah.
Yes.
I'm sorry. Did you want to speak?
No, you go ahead.
Yeah, no. Well, one of the things that I wanted to take note of is, within the United States, within the reparations movement, for example, one of the things we know is that Japanese Americans were given reparations for being interned during World War II, and a lot of times this issue is discussed, them getting reparations, but very often it's not made clear what was going on globally that helped them to get the reparations. And one of the big issues was that there was this big auto industry controversy within the United States. We were trying to restrict Japanese cars from coming over because it was an impact on the US auto industry. And somehow there was a negotiation that took place between Japan and the United States around limiting their cars coming to the United States. And that actually, Japan leveraged their power to help Japanese people get reparations in that context, right? And why I mention this is because with respect to the reparations movement today, we hear Africa demanding slavery reparations for Africa. This is a tricky issue because I'm sure most of you have heard of African American organizations that have issues around Pan-Africanism, but this is one of those things that triggers people. How is it that Africa should get slavery reparations for us being enslaved when we are suffering from the generational impact of being enslaved while we are in we say diaspora, but we are Afro-descendants, so we're separating from that label a little bit these days, according to the United Nations. But as Afro-descendants, we are suffering from the generational harm, specifically from being enslaved. In any case, my position is this, that African nations can leverage their power, their resources, to help all of us get reparations in the same way that Japan leveraged to get Japanese Americans reparations. And so the problem right now is that it seems to be more of a self-interested approach, but I think that would need to change. So that's one of those problems that I see right now.
Mhm. Yes, I
Yeah,
wanted to come in. Yes. Mhm.
I'd like also to think about some of the, and thank you very much, Professor Clinton Hutton and Bright and Deidre, for all that you've contributed so far. One of the ways that I think in my own scholarship around African presence in the Caribbean is that following Stuart Hall, for example, for a lot of us, and building on what Professor Clinton said earlier around self-discovery and Marcus Garvey's invocation that the first path to education, the first way that we enter into education is through self-discovery. That self-discovery of our Africanness and self-discovery of who we are as African people in the Caribbean context is not a given. And I think that's one of the challenges of really embracing a Pan-Africanist philosophy and a Pan-Africanist view, because one of the things that we can admit does exist in the Caribbean context is a desire to distance ourselves, in fact, from that presence, from that African presence. And so one of the ways that we invoke that is through a sort of symbolic enactment, through the music, through the creative arts, through these kinds of pursuits, rather than through these materialities that we're discussing here, that Deidre points out, that African countries with vast resources have certain responsibilities. In the Caribbean region in particular, we've tended to focus more specifically on a symbolic presence of Africa, and are only now in recent times coming to this kind of relationship that Bright describes, that is Jamaica signing an agreement with Ghana for trade in professionals and health professionals and so on. I know Grenada only this year ratified their visa-free travel between Grenada and Ghana. I know this because I was trying to get to Ghana last year and it hadn't been finalized yet. Also, I know the Prime Minister of Grenada, for example, has been very vocal in his desire to be closer to the African continent in these very structural, material, and economic ways that historically has not really been the case in the Caribbean in our relationship to Africa. So that's one of the challenges, I believe, is one of basic self-discovery. That we are, in fact, I say that as a young person, that was something that was in my orbit in my home, because I had a parent who had a Pan-Africanist consciousness, who was very engaged, and who because I was very curious, inculcated that in me. But the average young person in the Caribbean, I would put out the challenge: what is the average young person in the Caribbean's relationship to their Africanness, and how does that then translate into desire to decolonize our education system, to decolonize how we think of ourselves in relationship to the African continent? How does that translate? Because for us here on this panel, it would appear that we're all sort of in agreement, even in agreement around the complexities of what it means to enact a Pan-Africanist mode, to be in a relationship of Pan-Africanism. But I wanted us to also think about what it means on the ground in a region that has historically sort of distanced itself. I know, growing up in the Caribbean, there's a lot of colorism, there's a lot of conversations. Like Professor Clinton said, you don't need white people for white supremacy to be the ordering mechanism of the day. So that basic self-discovery, I think, is one of the challenges to enacting these relationships of Pan-Africanism that broaden our scope, our thinking, but also mobilizes these kinds of renewed relationships like the one that Bright describes, between the African continent and the diaspora.
So, Tesfa, given your point of view, do you believe that Pan Africanism is gaining momentum, particularly? Let's focus on Grenada, particularly in Grenada. What have you seen? What are the trends right now?
I mean, I wouldn't call myself an expert, particularly in that realm, but I I wouldn't say yes. No, I wouldn't say yes. I would say that there is still,
What a
at
work
the
to
most
do.
basic level, a need for us collectively to think about our relationship to our African heritage that moves beyond just a symbolic and sort of creative relationship. I think we've done a really good job of invoking Africa in the creative arts and so on, and as sort of a symbolic relationship. But also, if you believe Dion Brand is a scholar writing out of Canada, and she has a book called A Map to the Door of No Return. And Dion Brand says that um, that cosmological break of the Middle Passage is one where a certain kind of return is impossible. So then, how do we think about what is possible in the context of this Pan-African diaspora? What do we think is possible? And I think voices like Professor Hutton are are very important to help us to think about what is possible. But in as somebody, I know that there are pockets of people that are interested in these things. I think that there was a moment, I grew up in a moment in Grenada where the praying mantis was singing about Pan-Africanism. He was singing about figures like T.A. Marisho, that in the calypso music that I heard as a young person, that Pan-African consciousness was very apparent. I have cousins who, in fact, a lot of my siblings and I have African names because my father had a book of African names, and my name Tesfa is an Ethiopian name. My brother has a Hausa Nigerian name. My sister has an Igbo name. And so that was it wasn't just an idea in a book. It was something that oscillated in the community. It was something that you heard. It was something that, if you were curious about why, I was curious about why my cousin was named Biko, for example, that there was a path of curiosity that I could follow that would lead me to Africa, that would lead me to the African continent. And that, especially for those of us who have parents who were part of the revolutionary movement in Grenada, or who were interested in revolution, and whose ideas, and this is work that Bright does, whose ideas are connected to African liberation, whose ideas are connected to what is happening in places like Ghana at a certain moment. Then we grew up in an atmosphere that fomented a certain relationship to our Africanness, to African consciousness, African liberation, Pan-Africanism, and so on. But I'm not sure that that exists in the same way in Grenada now. And but I do think that it's a very important. And when we think about reparations, maybe that the CARICOM 10-point plan does have does think about reparations through the framework of repairing our knowledge systems, our epistemologies. And I think that that's one of the places that we can go to think about reparations. How do we repair our epistemologies? How do we take voodoo as an epistemology for Caribbean life and for Caribbean thinking? I think there is a ways to go, but I'm hopeful that that's a part of our future thinking in Grenada and elsewhere.
To jump in quick,
I have, sorry, what, right.
so I was just going to say that the distancing from Africa is very critical, right? Because you ask yourself, why are people invested in distancing themselves from Africa? It is rooted in the perception that Africa is primitive, Africa is backwards, Africa is the antithesis of Europe, right? You have, I mean, in the archives, you have some Grenadians writing to the British, that we are not Africans. We are Europe. We speak our mother tongue is English, that we are looking to Europe, not to Africa, right? So when you have the New Jewel movement come in, and they are actively involved in bringing Africa as a center, right? Celebrations around the May 25th, African Liberation Day. It's a rupture from that, from that colonial project, okay? That we are Africans, that African struggle is our struggle. And I think that moment of solidarity also moved beyond this whole idea of Africa as this Grenadian seeing Africa as a kind of cultural heritage, right? Because then they became involved politically. They had people like Sally Mugabe, the first lady of Zimbabwe, coming to Grenada, right? Grenada offering passports to those fighting for independence in Southern Africa, right? There's an investment. But when your education system is attacked, when all of a sudden you're not teaching a history that is politically invested in Black liberation, then there's that gap. And that hole is then filled with the old trope of distancing from Africa.
Okay, I have two questions when I come back, but I just want us to recognize the sponsors of the program: Jail Professional Solutions, Inc., Gem FM carrying the program on FM radio in Canada, out of Canada, and Grenada Technical and Allied Workers Union, GTAU.
Attention all workers, your health and safety at work are critical. At Grenada Technical and Allied Workers Union, we are dedicated to ensuring you have a safe and secure work environment. If you encounter unsafe conditions or are involved in an accident, take immediate actions. Report it to the company, your shop steward, and make sure it reaches your union. Your health and safety is a priority, and a strong union means a strong voice for your rights. Don't wait. Address concerns right away and protect your well-being. For a safer workplace and a better quality of life, stand with the Grenada Technical and Allied Workers Union. Together, we can create a safer, healthier work environment for everyone.
Yes. So my first question is, and I think Clinton, maybe you can more answer that, is it's two parts. A, whether Garvey and his movement, they saw, in addition to education, economics being important in terms of this struggle, this Pan-African struggle. A. B, whether, if that is so, whether it is something new that he brought to the movement or whether the roots of that was there before. So that's my first question. And my second question is, why is it, if I'm correct, that the issue of reparations, reparatory justice in the form of the wealth that was extracted from our ancestors, their labor and so, why is it this is a 21st century phenomenon, more so?
Okay. Reparation is not a 20th century phenomenon. It was always there, even during slavery. What is different? The difference is there is a global movement for that now. We had an uprising in Jamaica in 1865 led by Paul Bogle, 27 years after slavery was abolished. And one of the slogans of that uprising was liberty of person, liberty of land. That both freedom and the identity of African people in Jamaica cannot be separated from the land being liberated for them to control and to own. right? That freedom equals liberty of person and liberty of land. There were some of Paul Bogle's people, including one of his deputies, a young man at the time, 23 years old, by the name of McLaren, who was advocating that the people should own the land on which they were enslaved without compensation. So that has always been there. The St. Lucian in the 1940s, Arthur Lewis, who was the first vice chancellor, native vice chancellor of the University of the West Indies, actually advocated for reparations. During Trinidad's move for independence, they call on the British, to assist the development of Trinidad now that they are independent. They were calling for reparation. The same thing in Jamaica. And of course, the British, the thieves that they are without any moral compass, said no such thing, right? The British paid £20 million to the people who owned Africans in enslavement in the Caribbean, including Grenada, including Jamaica, all over. And they paid £20 million to the slaveholders for loss of their stock. They borrowed the money, the British Parliament, that we're talking about now, 1/3 of the British GDP went to pay them in the early 1930s. Do you know when the British finished paying off for that, the loan they borrowed for it? In 2015. So reparation was always an issue, but now that was reparation in reverse. Right? The people in Haiti, the population of Haiti when they made their revolution was 500,000. 40% of that population died to make their revolution. They declared their freedom under Jean-Jacques Dessalines. And in that's 1904. After 13 years of fighting for that freedom. In 1825, France and the West ganged up against Haiti. Now, look here, we will not seek to reinstitute slavery on you if you paid us for the loss of taking your freedom. The French government, the French state ordered that the Asian state paid them 190 million gold francs. It was so odious that by 1835, they had to move it down to 90. The French had to move it down to 90 because it was so odious. It was so out of place. And for that 90 million gold francs, the Asian, including people who were born long after slavery in the 20th century, kept on paying for that until 1947. From 1825 until 1947, the Asian population was paying for its freedom that they won on the battlefield. Right? When Aristide called that be given back to the Asian people, they kidnapped him and removed him from power. This is the impunity that exists in the world. And it's the impunity that can exist because of our lack of consciousness and because of divide and rule. Right? So reparation was always an issue. The difference is there's a big movement for that at this point in time. But there's also, apart from that type of reparation, there needs to be an internal reparation. What does that mean? Should we have a place like we do have in Jamaica called Discovery Bay, paying homage to Columbus's genocide of the native people? We have a place in Jamaica called Discovery Bay. Columbus came here and they discovered us because there were no people here. That is the key philosophical issue of genocide. There were no people in Palestine. There are still no people there. There were no people in North America. The Europeans killed hundreds, literally, hundreds of millions of native peoples. And while they were doing that, they were acknowledging that they don't exist. And so I grew up as a boy going to the movie, 13, 14, 15, and hate Native Americans. Long after they were exterminated, the film continued to portray them as savages. And the people who did genocide to them, they are civilized people. So that our education, and we are all linking it with Gyamfi, because we have Gyamfi symbolically with one of my brethren, past brethren and colleague from UWI, Louis Lindsay, called symbolic manipulation. You deal with Gyamfi symbolically. And as Walter Rodney said, they brought back his body, but they did not bring back his philosophy and opinions. Right? So that Gyamfi's aim about education, and to what end? Self-discovery. Because discovering of self will shape how you behave. That's the importance of it, you know. If you discover yourself, you will behave in the interest of yourself and not in the interest of Europe. So we still have that superstructure, that culture and educational evidence, and that continues. But there's also the structural, the structure put in place, the non-cultural part put in place by the Europeans. So for example, African countries don't trade with themselves more than so. They trade with their colonizers rather than developing new structure, what I call internal reparation, new structure that will help us to connect, to develop. So you need visa from a neighbor to come, one African people. Barbados is the closest part of the Caribbean to Africa. And you have to go to the United States in order to go to Africa, or go to Europe in order to go to Africa. I went to Martinique, and the fare from Jamaica to Martinique could take me to Britain. I mean, we are living with some issues that they are unthinkable in a sense, but that is our reality.
Yeah, so I just wanted to focus on, because my understanding is that Gyamfi basically paid attention. He wanted the black dollar, to put it this way, to be spent for black people, to be used to develop black people. Yeah?
Yes.
So I'm asking whether that was something new that he brought to the movement, or whether that was always there. I think I got
It's
part of the answer.
No, it's part of the tradition.
Yes.
But
yes,
he
yes.
substantially amplified that and made
Right.
it into a main goal of his, not just his philosophy, but of his economic and civilizational developmental program.
Right.
In fact, Garvey argues that black people will be disrespected around the world, wherever they are around the world, if Africa does not become a superpower. If Africa becomes a superpower, which was the goal of the Garveyite movement, to make Africa into a superpower intellectually, scientifically, culturally, and militarily. That if it does not become a superpower, people around the world will disrespect Africans wherever they are. But if they are a power in the world, people will respect them.
Okay. Sister Farmer, I know you have something on the reparations issue.
No, I wanted to say, I think I dream of that world where we're all respected and thought highly of because we have realized our full capacity and express it in the world. And I believe that day is coming. I was looking at Garvey's. He had a tremendous number of businesses, so he was fiercely entrepreneurial. So we know that even the Black Star Line was about trade as well as travel and repatriation. And within the United States, there were some other reparations, successful reparations cases early on, and as early as the 1700s. Belinda Royale had won a case for compensation from her former owners, and then there was another case where someone won in court about $2,500, and at the time that was significant. That was Henrietta Woods. But what I wanted to say about our work around the Benin bronzes is that we actually, because we've been in this battle to get ownership of these relics, Nigeria has not been willing to meet with us. The Oba of Benin has not been willing to meet with us. He did send an advisor who sent us to the government, and the government has not really wanted to meet with us. But of course, we are not giving up that easily, and so we have mobilized globally. So we have, you may know Esther Sose, coming out of the UK, but she is Caribbean. She is representing Caribbean interests. We have Sheila Camarati Silva, who's from Brazil, who is representing Brazilian interests in this mobilization. And we have made the decision that we are launching a museum, a franchise that would be global and for cultural education, as well as engaging in community investments. So our vision is to use this cultural education institution to actually develop our communities globally. So I just want you all to know, if you hear about what it is that we're doing, understand that it is a reparations movement. The Benin bronzes are literally laundered slave trade profits. They are our reparations. They are literally the money. They are the money, which a lot of folks just don't fully appreciate. I want to also ask that you visit our website to basically, you can go to our website, restitutionstudygroup.org or rsgncorp.org, and just type in a letter supporting our effort, because one of the things that some of the institutions, the museums that are holding the relics are suggesting is that who are we in the community? This is a suggestion that we're not enough, but we know that we're enough, and we want the community to at least send a note backing us up, okay? Because that will just send the message loud and clear that we all want our seat at the table. It cannot only be that Nigeria and the Benin Kingdom elites, the royals, are sitting at the table determining what happens to the relics. And note, one of the reasons why we don't know anything about this, the bronzes and our connection to them, is that none of the museums tell our side of the story. They do not mention anything about the slave trade origin of these bronzes. I happened to learn about it doing a paper in law school, and I've taken the issue further since the Smithsonian decided they were going to give the bronzes away. But this is our reparations, $30 billion worth, and we should definitely let our voices be heard on the issue so that we can engage. We can leverage our ownership of these relics to further ourselves development-wise, economic development.
Okay, I think Tesfa, Dwight, you have each of you have an announcement to make, or one of you?
No, I'd just like to hop in on the conversation around reparations, because we've had a certain relationship to reparations and to what Professor Clinton referred to earlier around the UCL archives and British compensation for former enslavers in the context of reparations. In fact, every term I lead my students that I teach here in Montreal at Dawson College through an exercise where I take them into the University College London website for the Legacies of British Slavery website, and I have them do a calculation of a specific known Grenadian enslaver by the surname Trevelyan, and we find all of the Trevelyan's in the Legacies of British Slavery archives, and we do a calculation of how much money they would have been compensated in today's dollars at at emancipation, and then we contrast that with the amount of money that one of their descendants gave to the CARICOM Reparations Commission, the amount of $100,000, I believe, or £100,000, and the calculation that the students come up with, it's about £6 million in compensation that Trevelyan family received. And so in Grenada, we've received Laura Trevelyan very graciously. We had a whole ceremony. She came, she met with young students in Grenada. She did her Mea Culpa tour. She had a BBC documentary about her family and so on. And then she has continued some kind of advocacy work, but like Professor Martin Felix was writing about in the Grenada Today just this week, in this week's edition of the Grenada Today newspaper, the New Today newspaper that used to formerly be the Grenada Today, one of the things that is absent from that very grounded Grenadian conversation around reparations is what emerges out of that compensation. What kind of concrete reparatory material steps emerges from that compensation framework that is now happening, where the descendants of those who were enslavers are now acknowledging and wanting to make some kind of reparations. The Bank of England, for example, 2 years ago had an exhibition in London acknowledging their part in ownership of 2 estates in Grenada, acknowledging that they were compensated at emancipation in Grenada as well. That exhibit has remained in London. That exhibit has not come to Grenada. Grenadians have no relationship to that. It's again, it's a mea culpa tour for the descendants of former enslavers. So one of the questions that I want to ask, and I think is useful to ask in the context of reparations conversations, is what comes after the mea culpa? What comes after the apology? What comes after that? The CARICOM 10-point plan, for example, is quite comprehensive in terms of thinking through things like knowledge systems. One of the things that happens when I send my students to look, to compare what is being asked for in the 10-point plan to what is structurally at work in a lot of these Caribbean islands, they can't find any information They can't find any information on what is the situation of health in Dominica, for example. And so, of course, that tells us that there is a need for reparations at that very basic level of information gathering and information sharing. If I need to know anything about Grenada or the context of slavery in Grenada, I need to go to the British archives. Again, we've been talking tonight around self-discovery. Self-discovery doesn't happen in a vacuum. Self-discovery happens in the context of access to information. One of the things that is very evident here is that those of us on this panel have a certain kind of access to information. We may be institutionally affiliated, we work in university environments, but what does that mean for the process of self-discovery in a holistic way, especially given the reality that these former enslavers in persons like Laura Trevelyan are now in our orbit, are now in our consciousness? How do we become the ones who are directing this process and who are making the demands that we need in the form of repair for our Caribbean societies? I think is one of the questions that we need to keep close to us going forward as well.
Okay, let me just say,
I leave you to make the announcement. Mm-hmm. Oh
yes. So I was going to say, let me just say that sometime before the end of July, Sister Farmer will be back, and we will be discussing litigation strategy and reparations, because she has done quite a bit of work in actually bringing litigation and instituted litigation. Using the court system, using the legal system, and it is something that we can discuss, or we use the system in the US, in the Caribbean, in the UK, internationally, to, in a sense, as one aspect of that struggle. Not the only one, because of course it just has to be one. All the other work that is being done is critical in that respect. So I think, Dwight, you have an announcement to make also?
right.
Oh, so
Right,
yeah,
sorry.
in July, I will be speaking in Grenada for the Emancipation Lecture on the African struggles, our struggle, the African dimension of the Grenadian Revolution. So I hope to continue that conversation from what we've been talking about from here.
Right.
And if I could just make a plug, Bright's work is extremely timely. It really does the work of working through all of these diasporic nodes and really bringing to the fore the présence africaine, in the words of Stuart Hall, in the Grenada Revolution, in the process, that a lot of the thinking that's emerging around African liberation is seeding a revolutionary thought and revolutionary consciousness in the Caribbean, but also very specifically in Grenada. So I really encourage those of you, I am just so sorry to miss it in person, Bright, but I really encourage those of you who are home in Grenada to make your way to Norton's Hall for the Emancipation Lecture this year.
Yes. You wanted to come in, Aisha?
Yes, I just wanted to ask a question. This is an audience question before the panel leaves. The question is, why, well, I don't have a name, but I do have a question. So it says, why with so much learning and activism by people of African descent, nothing changes even when people of African descent are in the position of power and influence? The names of Barack Obama, Kamala Harris, and Kimi Badenoch were referenced. So this is a question that we got prior to the show, Mr. Layne, if you recall. So anybody could answer.
Well, one thing I remember from Barack Obama was that Democrats in Congress and the Senate basically let him know that they're not going to pass his laws, or they're not necessarily going to be supporting him. So just because we had a Black president didn't mean that we had members of the party, the Democratic Party, supporting him, which to me was quite shocking. But you don't see that happening with folks with our current president. They seem to march in line and show their support, but he was not getting a lot of support. And I remember there always being a threat, the nuclear, that he would do the nuclear, take the nuclear step, basically meaning to change the rules so that certain things that he wants to get through. And he never really took it. And unfortunately, the Democrats, the party I used to be a member of, I'm now independent at this point, but the Democrats do not use all of their power. And unfortunately, it has resulted in what we see today. So hopefully the next generation is a little more bolder and will take stronger steps. But I think that's one of the challenges, just not exercising his full power as an executive, right? But also not getting the cooperation of his own party. This is
so. Is it a case that the system is stronger, although an individual is thrown up, the system is much stronger than them? Or maybe that individual that is thrown up is really a representative of the system?
Well, I think probably he's smart enough to know that he has limits that our current president does not have. There are things that that our current president does that Barack Obama would have, he would have been removed a long time ago. He wouldn't be allowed to get away with at all. So, he probably did as much as he could do, but once again, he experienced a lot of resistance from his own party.
Yes, okay. So the time is running out. We have to end soon. I see a comment there. So many African nations at war by African men for their own religious ideologies. And Jomo Sanga is saying, good history lesson, Dr. Clinton. We don't have much comments, but I'm almost certain that it does not indicate that people were not gripped, because I myself was quite gripped by all the lessons. So I don't know if we could take final comments, and we will start with you, Professor.
Yeah, well, the issue of Barack Obama, we have to remember our history. We have a long history. Lumumba was assassinated. Who were the culprits in that? The head culprit is from the Congo. And he ruled for 30 odd years and became the richest man there because he was doing the bidding of Europe and the United States. Right? So we must be very clear that sometimes the issue is not a question of skin color. It's a question of what you defend. It's a question of clarity of your place in the framing of human destiny and where you are in that. Right? Gaddafi from Libya was advocating for African currency. Right? That's a big issue now. And that issue is still at play. And the import of that for Africa and its independence. Mm-hmm. In stemming things like when sanctions, for example, right? Gaddafi wanted certain things, Pan-Africanist things, for the African continent. He was killed under the leadership and direction of the United States of America when Barack Obama was the president of the United States of America. Let us be very clear and have no sentimental feelings with respect to skin color on that issue. Let us be very clear, right? Libya was invaded. Gaddafi killed in the streets of Libya. And the people who were brought in or armed and financed to do that. Libya is not a failed state. You know, the people who are combating the rising revolution in the Sahel are some of those same people who were involved in the killing of Gaddafi. What Burkina Faso and Mali and those countries, what is threatening their survival today are those people who were armed to destroy Libya. And Langley, who talk about this person controlling the goal for himself, right? Who is he? He's head of the American African Command. African American, set up to destroy Africa, to destroy any semblance of wanting to have a sovereign state or sovereign states where the resources are for the African people themselves. Let us be very clear on that. I am from Jamaica, where Jamaican blood was shed by the United States of America, pitting one set of Jamaicans against the other. We have to learn to come out of that and not be licky, as we would say in Jamaica, nyami, nyami, and beggy. We have to be very clear that we have historically been used to destroy the people who have been the type of leaders who want to take us out of the situation. We have to remember that. There were African people fighting against the enslavement of Africans in the New World, on the African continent. There were wars in Africa against slavery, against the trade. You know what? Those leaders were assassinated, and some of them were actually enslaved in the Caribbean. That continues today in a different form, under different circumstances. So that the struggle for reparation is a legal struggle, it's a political struggle, it's a philosophical struggle, it's a social struggle. It requires linking with ourselves and linking with allies. That struggle will not come to an end, because African people, this is the youngest population in the world in terms of age. That demographic significance will play itself out in the next couple of decades. Believe me.
Good night.
That's it.
Okay, thank you. Bright?
So because of time, I will be very brief, but I think it's very important that we do understand the structures at play. And some of these structures, some of our leaders have given us the conceptual framework to understand these things. Nkrumah talks about neocolonialism, the last stage of imperialism, and how, in theory, our countries are free, and yet, in actual realities, we are still in bondage to our European colonizers. Senegal, most of French West Africa, over 70% of its natural reserve are still in France. How can a country grow when they're still being controlled? Ghana, we talk about owning a lot of gold. But in reality, Ghana owns just 2%, if not lower than that gold. All these things are owned by foreign entities. So this neoliberal agenda that while Africa is wealthy, its people are still struggling. How then do we develop frameworks? How then do we preach the gospel to get people to understand? As Stokely Carmichael once said, the job of the conscious is to make the unconscious conscious. So I'm really happy to have participated in this particular platform as we ensure that our people are becoming politically conscious about the structures that are at play or trying to bring African peoples globally down. But there's still a fight to resist this struggle.
Tesfa?
Thank you very much. This was, I think, what Walter Rodney would call a groundings. A really happy time of sharing ideas and learning a lot. Professor Clinton, the more I look at you, I think we met some years ago at the CSA.
Oh,
yes.
Yes, that would be so. Yes.
So,
Yeah.
I'm really grateful for these very important conversations as we think through all of these the ways that these structures, like Bright said, intersect. I think in my own sort of political economy training, I know that all of what we talk about, all of these relationships that we highlight exist within global colonial structures, global structures of inequality. And Caribbean nations like ours, tiny Caribbean nations, occupy a very degraded place within those webs of power that come from these histories of colonialism and continue to be influenced by that. I mean, one of the statistics that I share with my students is how much the African continent is actually propping up the West, like Bright describes that we're transferring billions and billions of dollars in wealth to the West every year, and that has been the case since 1492, since the rupture of 1492. That the African continent, countries of the Caribbean, for example, have been making these massive wealth transfers to the West and propping up the industrial West. And so when we make a demand for reparations, our demand for reparations is in fact warranted. It's in fact just. It's in fact the way it ought to be, because this is, like Deidre said, this is our money. These are our ideas, like Professor Clinton said. These are our philosophies, and we need to be the ones to cultivate them. And like Bright says, these are ongoing struggles. Professor Ronaldo Walcott describes it as the long emancipation, that the event of emancipation doesn't end in 1834, 1838, but that we continue in the wake of emancipation. And so the work that we do to think through all of these things is the work of emancipation and is the work of freedom as people of a global African diaspora. So thank you again.
Thank you, Sister Farmer.
Yeah, I'd like to thank you for inviting me to be a part of this forum. I want to give a shout out to Jomo Sanga Thomas, who was one of our attorneys on the reparations litigation. And I also just would like to add to what Professor Peterson just said, that we have a little way to go in terms of finding ways to work in unity. But I think if we recognize what value we each bring to the table, for example, with Africa, I'm sorry, it was Dr. Bright that mentioned this. If we pay attention to the dollar value that, for example, even in the United States, we have like a $1.7 trillion GDP within the African American people for 2030, okay, we can look within the Pan African community for sources of development, and part of the whole idea of welcoming us home means welcoming home some of those resources. We don't have to look to Western nations for any kind of loans or support. And granted, you were talking about how little the wealth is that stays within African nations, but we can actually recognize that, rather than just demanding the repatriation of artifacts, maybe we should be demanding the repatriation of the people, right, that were stolen away, right? And of course, because African nations have the power to make that happen, we can control our destiny if we just welcome our people home. I think that's a good place to start. But that's my 2 cents here.
Okay, thank you, Aisha. Oh, maybe Aisha, before you we should just recognize a comment from Barry Pierce. He says, Garvey, we should remember Booker T. Washington when we speak of Garvey. And he also says, we in the US are going after the US government for reparations. And I just want to again thank our sponsors, GEL Professional Solutions, GMFM out of Canada, and Grenada Technical and Allied Workers Union for sponsoring and enabling us to carry this program week after week.
Attention all workers, your health and safety at work are critical. At Grenada Technical and Allied Workers Union, we are dedicated to ensuring you have a safe and secure work environment. If you encounter unsafe conditions or are involved in an accident, take immediate actions. Report it to the company, your shop steward, and make sure it reaches your union. Your health and safety is a priority, and a strong union means a strong voice for your rights. Don't wait. Address concerns right away and protect your well-being. For a safer workplace and a better quality of life, stand with the Grenada Technical and Allied Workers Union. Together, we can create a safer, healthier work environment for everyone.
Okay, I see a question from Barbara Andrews, but I think that was answered by Professor Clinton answered it, but we have to end now. Aisha, you want to say anything before we close?
I just wanted to thank the panelists this evening. I think that the conversation was very enlightening, especially for me. And I think a lot of younger persons who are now being exposed to Pan-Africanism and learning more about our roots and, trying our best to join the conversation. So I just wanted to thank everyone. Professor Hutton in particular, I think you gave a real crash course in history, but it was appreciated by all of us in particular. So thank you so much to the panel. I look forward to seeing everyone again, especially Professor Paellmann. I can't wait for us to speak about litigation because I was looking at the cases and I was doing some research. And Tesfa, I'm hoping to meet you in Grenada soon, and Bright as well. We'll be meeting up soon and having discussions.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Thank you to all of you, the guests. Really thank you. And thank you to all those who follow the program and those who will follow it on YouTube later. I know many people tell me they follow it after. Thank you all, and until next week. Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Night, everyone.
One love. One love.
One love.